Also, Sisi, can you tell us more about your side projects, for your case studies and side projects? For example, you had done a Spotify redesign project. So if you can give us a walkthrough of that.
Yeah, actually, that was more of a case study than it was. I think it was because it was like very short term. It was actually nice because I had to set very strict like bound constraints and understand what I can do in like maybe 2 weeks. And because a lot of my other projects are more end to end, involving a lot of user research, a lot of like repetitive testing. This was kind of a chance for me to be a little more creative um, and yeah. And I also it was more of like a passion project because I was also interested in like podcasts and how podcasts fit within Spotify. And I kind of approached it like it's like a redesign exercise. So I looked at existing flow and I did talk to um, users about their existing experience of podcasts or like how they currently find new podcasts. And I found out like there are these main pain points, and you probably see this process kind of exists for every kind of UX project, but I think I found it really helpful to look at kind of existing examples, and I think just try to be like more critical about like what was successful, what was not. And I found that like I think Spotify did a really good job, but there was also this I think issue of like content discovery and personalization, and that was kind of the bit where like AI comes in sometimes. There's just always like I don't know if you know like the Netflix problems, like you're on a loop. Basically, they only suggest what you watch, and you can't really discover new content. So that was like this is my attempt at like trying to maybe look at how can we start looking at broadening people's horizons or like through content discovery. And I did attend this conference, AI. It's called like ML UX conference at Spotify. That basically they talked about like what they, how they work at Spotify, as well as their principles of ML design, and or like identifying friction, automated away, and then they had asked the right questions, and then go manual before you go magical, which really stood out to me because ultimately it is a design process, and you have to like really find the problem to be able to tackle it with AI. So yeah, these are just like things I realized that can just like questions that came up to me during the process, and I encourage everyone to like write questions down as they are maybe using an app or going through a design process, because all these questions will come at the end, when you're trying to critique your own design project. It's like, have I answered those questions? And I just skip a lot of steps here, but like I would just jump like straight to the solution. Okay. Um, so as I was saying, one of the main issues I realized is like the navigation, and it kind of like this is like just the first issue I kind of noticed people realizing is that it's really hard to discover podcasts because they're still primarily giving focus to music right now. And although I did read that they are trying to grow their podcast business, so I do foresee in the future that they might want a more balanced view of podcast versus music. And yeah, and I think these kind of the other features are just broken down into kind of what I discovered from the user insight of like, they hope to connect more with the community and a better personalized experience. And yeah, and also like the last, the sync calendar is more of just, I was trying to think outside the box, what future features may the user want. And yeah, and I think it was a very almost like fun exercise for me because I didn't have the normal constraints of like work. It was more of a passion project, so I could be a little more creative and think outside of the box for this. And at the same time, I did keep kind of this like AI ML considerations in mind. For example, how does it become better over time, and how can we gather user behavior, just active input versus passive collection. And because, as I said, you don't want the user to always be giving you feedback, about those pop-ups. And like, for example, also like what are the metrics to test success? And yeah, just like those are things that are in mind as I am designing along the way. And yeah, we can kind of, I went through these like series of design iterations, and ultimately these are kind of the main features that I landed on. So the first is better navigation between music and podcast. And for example, it will be, you can able to switch from music to podcast from the homepage. So some of these are just like very small changes or seemingly like obvious changes, which I think like it's very necessary also. And if it's obvious, doesn't mean like, it's not good design. And I think that's part of all this whole thing about like making intuitive user experience. And it doesn't have to be like, mind blowing sometimes. And the second part is this like smart search. So I realized, for example, with AI, it's really great at certain tasks. For example, like classifying things, finding connection between things. And so this utilizes that and basically returns categorized results based on relevancy. And you can also toggle between music and podcast, because right now the search just contains like everything. It's all combined. And I think if you can toggle between, it provides more clarity as well. And then for the personalization aspect, I really thought about like, my friend was telling me how he listens to kind of different podcasts, throughout the day. Like maybe on his commute, he will listen to like news channels, versus later on at work, he would listen to more lighthearted shows or like, crime show series. So I thought about maybe it could be interesting to categorize, have different personas for your different times of the day, and you can kind of curate what that looks like. And your return results will also be different. And yeah, that was just like a kind of a new concept I explored, allowing the user to create their own profile, allowing them to customize like length of the podcast, time of day, and yeah, and I just wanted to see like how that would change their listening experience. And then lastly is maybe syncing with their calendars, because I realized people listen to podcasts. One thing is like your your schedule really determines what you listen to, depending how much time you have. Also, like I might change my listening habit if I know that one show is coming out, if I know the frequency of when they're coming out with new episodes. So this is a way to kind of visualize new episodes with your current schedule and seeing that how that might impact your preferences. But ultimately, I think I did make a lot of assumptions along the way, because I think that's a huge like lesson I learned is there will always be assumptions, and you have to keep in track of what those assumptions are. So later you can address it or test those assumptions. So yeah, so people sometimes may not know that like they have podcasts or like they want to listen to podcasts. It is, and I'm also assuming that it is hard to explore new genres. And obviously, you might be a podcast genius and might exactly know where to find things or know what you want. But I assume that most cases people are blurry about that. Like I might like certain styles. I might not like all crime, because some are much like, they're like, I think with podcasts it's more nuanced, because you have tone, there's a style of podcast, there's different content within different genres. So this is one way of trying to understand what the specific interests of the user might be through time. And I did talk to actually a Spotify designer, and it's funny because yeah, I was like, actually it was like very out of the blue. I just like messaged him. I was like, hey, like I'm just like interested in this and I would love to get your feedback. And he said that they're actually tackling this problem at Spotify right now, is the whole podcast, they have a like issue. So it was very kind of eye-opening to understand like his perspective and like their constraints on the company side. And then yeah, like after I talked with him, I started to maybe explore new ways of exploring, maybe things that don't fit into their existing design systems. Thinking about maybe there's a better way to explore like latent connections. And yeah, and this is still like kind of an ongoing project. I got a little kind of busy after that, but I definitely kind of want to continue it at some point. But my biggest learning is there's like understanding where AI ML can come into place versus what might not need AI ML functionalities, determining what kind of information is needed from the user or model training for model training, how to design alongside music navigation. So a lot of it is also understanding like company priorities, right? Like especially when you're at the company. Obviously, I'm not there, so I don't know what their goals are, what their value statements are. Like maybe it's intentional for music to dominate. Um, so yeah, in that sense, like it's obviously very different being like a self-led project versus when you're at the company designing for them. So yeah, that was like ultimately kind of my biggest takeaway through this.
Yeah, that's a really nice project actually, since it separates. Uh, it was like a break for you, and also a way to
Yeah,
move to a different kind of space of being more creative and having more leverage. And it's amazing how you really went out of your way to speak to a Spotify designer and took inputs to implement in your passion project, and that speaks volumes about the kind of discipline that you have towards your projects and towards what you do. So that's amazing.
and I think like, and also I think it's also about like intention is like I don't just want this to be another like design case study or design challenge or whatever, but I definitely think like maybe there's things to contribute and to instigate that like new level of conversation. And also I think I encourage new designers to not just do it for the sake of doing a passion project, but more like be intentional about it. What are you going to learn from it? Set like goals, like what do you want out of this thing? Like what is the future impact going to be? Like how are you going to have what are you going to learn from this project? So yeah, I I think I'm just more like I don't really believe in like design for the sake of designing, but more there's a purpose behind it.
Right.
And yeah, that's I think that's like the one advice I would give like incoming designers or new designers.
That's great.